The autumn wind rustled through the trees of Central Park as Officer James Mitchell drove his police car slowly along the dimly lit path. It was 11:30 p.m., and the night shift had been quiet so far. He had been working this beat for 15 years, but something felt different tonight. The seasoned police officer's eyes caught a glimpse of movement near one of the old wooden benches, the same bench where he had noticed unusual activity for the past few days. Officer Mitchell parked his car at a distance and grabbed his flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness as he walked carefully toward the bench. His footsteps crunched on fallen leaves, breaking the nighttime silence. As he got closer, he could make out a small figure hurriedly gathering what looked like a blanket and a backpack. "Hey there," he called out softly, trying not to sound threatening. "Everything okay?" But before he could get any closer, the figure darted away, disappearing into the shadows of the trees. Officer Mitchell's flashlight beam caught only a glimpse of a dark blue school backpack and what appeared to be a young girl in a hoodie. He sighed, his breath visible in the cool night air. This was the third time this week he had seen the same scene play out. Back in his car, Officer Mitchell pulled out his small notebook where he had been keeping track of his observations. Each night for the past week, around the same time, he had spotted someone at that particular bench. The person was always alone and always ran away when anyone approached. But tonight, he had seen enough to confirm his suspicions. It was a young black girl, probably in her teens. The thought troubled him deeply. His own daughter, Emily, would have been about the same age if she hadn't lost her battle with leukemia 3 years ago. The memory of Emily made his heart ache, but it also strengthened his resolve to help this mysterious girl. The next night, Officer Mitchell arrived at the park a little earlier than usual. This time, he parked his car further away and waited patiently. At exactly 10:45 p.m., he saw her. The girl emerged from between the trees, carrying her blue backpack and what looked like a textbook. She glanced around carefully before settling on the bench. To his surprise, she pulled out a small reading light and opened the book. He watched as she studied, her dedication evident even from a distance. Every few minutes, she would look up and scan her surroundings, like a small animal always alert for predators. The sight made Officer Mitchell's chest tighten. No child should have to live like this. For the next hour, he observed as she read, took notes, and occasionally rubbed her hands together for warmth. When she finally packed up her books, she pulled out a thin blanket from her backpack and tried to make herself comfortable on the hard bench. The temperature was dropping, and Officer Mitchell could see her shivering even from his position. He decided it was time to try a different approach. Tomorrow, he would bring hot chocolate and some warm food. Maybe then she would trust him enough to stay and talk. As he watched her curl up on the bench, he remembered how Emily used to love hot chocolate with extra marshmallows on cold nights. Before leaving his post, Officer Mitchell made a few notes in his book. Subject appears to be a teenage girl, African American, approximately 15 to 16 years old. Carries a blue school backpack, studies at night, shows signs of being homeless but maintains good hygiene and appears to attend school, based on backpack and books. Extremely cautious around others. Need to investigate local missing persons reports and check with nearby schools. As he drove away that night, Officer Mitchell's mind was filled with questions. Why was this young girl sleeping in the park? Where was her family? How long had she been out here? The father in him couldn't bear the thought of leaving her another night in the cold, but the experienced police officer knew he needed to approach this situation carefully. One wrong move could send her running, and he might never see her again. He clicked on his car's heater as the temperature display showed 45 degrees Fahrenheit, 7 degrees Celsius. Tomorrow would be even colder, and time was running out. Whatever this girl's story was, Officer Mitchell was determined to help her, not just as a police officer, but as someone who knew all too well how precious and fragile young lives could be. The next evening, Officer Mitchell arrived at the park with a thermos of hot chocolate and a paper bag containing a warm sandwich from the deli across from the police station. His wife Sarah had added extra marshmallows to the hot chocolate, just like Emily used to love. The thought brought a sad smile to his face as he parked his patrol car farther away than usual. Tonight's air was even colder than yesterday, and his breath formed small clouds in front of his face. He waited patiently in his car, watching the bench through his binoculars. At exactly 10:45 p.m., right on schedule, the girl appeared from between the trees. Officer Mitchell waited until she had settled into her usual routine with her books before making his move. He grabbed the thermos and the paper bag, then started walking slowly toward the bench. You could see the exact moment she noticed him, her body tensed, and her hands quickly moved to gather her things. "Wait," he called out softly, stopping about 20 feet away. "I brought some hot chocolate. It's too cold out here to study without something warm to drink." The girl froze, one hand still on her backpack strap. Her eyes darted between Officer Mitchell and the darkness behind her, calculating her escape route. "I'll put it right here on this other bench," he said, placing the thermos and the bag on a bench about 10 feet from hers. "I'll step back, and you can get it if you want. No pressure." He moved back slowly, then sat down on a bench even further away. The girl watched him carefully, not moving from her spot. The only sound was the rustle of leaves in the wind. "My daughter used to love hot chocolate on cold nights," Officer Mitchell said quietly, looking up at the stars. "She always wanted extra marshmallows. My wife put some in this one too." For several long minutes, neither of them moved. Then, slowly, the girl reached for her textbook again. She kept reading, but Officer Mitchell noticed her eyes flickering toward the thermos every few seconds. After about 15 minutes, she finally stood up. Moving like a cautious deer, she quickly grabbed the thermos and the paper bag, then returned to her bench. Officer Mitchell pretended to be interested in his phone, giving her space. He heard the soft pop of the thermos lid opening, followed by a quiet sip. Then, even more quietly, he heard her whisper, "Thank you." "You're welcome," he replied, still looking at his phone. "I'm James. Officer Mitchell if you prefer, but James is fine." There was a long pause before she spoke again. "I'm Destiny." "Nice to meet you, Destiny. That looks like a heavy textbook you've got there." Destiny clutched the book closer to her chest. "It's advanced biology. I have a test tomorrow." "Must be hard to study out here in the cold," Officer Mitchell said carefully. He could see her tense up again, so he quickly added, "But it's impressive that you're working so hard. Biology was always tough for me in school." The girl relaxed slightly, taking another sip of hot chocolate. "I like it. I want to be a doctor someday." Officer Mitchell nodded, remembering all the doctors who had tried to help Emily. "That's a good dream to have. The world needs more good doctors." They sat in companionable silence for a while, Destiny sipping the hot chocolate and occasionally taking small bites of the sandwich. Officer Mitchell noticed she wrapped half of it carefully in the paper, saving it for later. "I'll be around tomorrow night too," he said finally, standing up slowly. "Same time. It's supposed to be even colder, so maybe some soup would be good. Any kind you particularly like?" Destiny hesitated before answering. "Chicken noodle is okay." "Chicken noodle it is," he smiled. "Good luck on your test tomorrow, Destiny." As he walked back to his car, Officer Mitchell heard her voice once more. "The marshmallows were nice. Thank you, James." He waited until he was back in his car before wiping the tears from his eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Trust, he knew, was like a delicate flower. It needed time, patience, and gentle care to grow. Tonight, he had planted the first seed. Over the next few nights, Officer Mitchell and Destiny fell into a routine. He would bring warm food and hot drinks, and they would sit on their separate benches, talking a little more each time. Tonight, he brought her favorite chicken noodle soup again, along with a warm wool blanket. The temperature had dropped to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 4 degrees Celsius, and he couldn't bear to see her shivering anymore. As Destiny wrapped the blanket around her shoulders, Officer Mitchell noticed how young she looked in the park's dim lighting. Her school uniform was clean but wrinkled, and her hair was neatly braided, though some strands had come loose in the wind. "I got an A on my biology test," she said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "The teacher said I had the highest score in class." "That's wonderful, Destiny." Officer Mitchell smiled. "You must have studied really hard for it." She nodded, stirring her soup slowly. "My mom would have been proud. She always said education was the way out." Her voice trailed off, and Officer Mitchell saw tears gathering in her eyes. He waited patiently, knowing this might be the moment Destiny finally shared her story. "She died 6 months ago," Destiny continued, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was diabetes. She couldn't afford the insulin anymore after she lost her job. I tried to help by getting a part-time job at the grocery store, but it wasn't enough." Officer Mitchell felt his heart breaking as he watched her wipe away tears with the corner of the blanket. "I'm so sorry, Destiny. Were there no relatives who could help? She shook her head. Mom was all I had. My dad left when I was a baby, and my grandparents passed away years ago. When Mom died, some people from social services came. They talked about foster care, but she paused, taking a shaky breath. I heard stories about foster homes, about kids being separated from their siblings or being moved around a lot. I couldn't risk it. I need to finish school here. It's what Mom wanted. So you've been on your own all this time? Officer Mitchell asked gently. How do you manage? Destiny straightened her shoulders slightly, showing a glimpse of pride. I had some money saved for my part-time job. I used the gym at school to shower. They open early for swim team practice. The librarian lets me stay late to do homework, and I have a locker at school where I keep my important stuff. Nobody knows I'm. She couldn't finish the sentence. But why this park? Officer Mitchell asked. It's close to school, she explained. And there's a 24-hour laundromat nearby where I can wash my uniform. Most importantly, it's well lit at night. She looked down at her soup. Mom and I used to come here for picnics on Sundays. It feels safer somehow. Officer Mitchell noticed how she kept her school uniform perfectly pressed despite her circumstances. You haven't missed a single day of school, have you? No, sir, Destiny said firmly. Mom always said education was everything. She wanted to be a nurse. She had to drop out of school when she got pregnant with me. That's why I want to be a doctor. I want to help people who can't afford medical care. No one should die because they can't afford insulin. The determination in her voice reminded Officer Mitchell so much of Emily that it hurt. His daughter had wanted to be a doctor too, before the leukemia took that dream away. You're very brave, Destiny, he said softly. But you don't have to do this alone anymore. She looked up at him, fear flickering across her face. Please don't report me. If I end up in foster care, I might have to change schools. I can't leave. All my advanced placement classes, my teacher's recommendations for college, I need them. Officer Mitchell leaned forward, his voice gentle but firm. Destiny, I promise you this, whatever happens next, we'll make sure you can stay in your school. But you can't keep sleeping in this park. Winter is coming, and it's not safe. Will you let me help you find a better way? Destiny looked at him for a long moment, then slowly nodded, a tear rolling down her cheek. I'm just so tired, she whispered. So tired of being alone. In that moment, Officer Mitchell knew his life was about to change forever. He couldn't save Emily, but maybe, just maybe, he could help save Destiny. The next morning, Officer Mitchell sat at his desk in the police station, surrounded by paperwork. His computer screen showed multiple tabs open: foster care regulations, emergency youth shelters, and social services contact information. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten as he made call after call. I'm sorry, Officer Mitchell, said the tired voice on the phone, but all our foster homes in the district are at capacity right now. The earliest we might have an opening is in 3 weeks. He rubbed his temples in frustration after hanging up. This was his 7th call of the morning, and each one ended the same way. Too full. No space. Waiting list. His notepad was filled with dead ends. During his lunch break, Officer Mitchell drove to Destiny's school, Roosevelt High. The building was old but well maintained, with motivational posters covering the hallway walls. In the main office, he met with Mrs. Rodriguez, Destiny's guidance counselor. Destiny Williams. Mrs. Rodriguez's eyes lit up with recognition. She's one of our best students. She's taking all advanced placement classes and has a perfect 4.0 GPA. She pulled out Destiny's file and showed him her academic record. Officer Mitchell leaned forward, studying the paper. Perfect attendance. President of the science club. Volunteer at the local food bank. The girl sleeping on a park bench had accomplished more than many students with stable homes. Did you notice anything different about her in the past 6 months? He asked carefully. Mrs. Rodriguez's face softened. I knew something was wrong when she started arriving extra early for school. She would sit in the library, sometimes falling asleep over her books. I offered to help, but she always said everything was fine. She paused, looking troubled. Is she in some kind of trouble, officer? No, he assured her quickly, but she needs help. I'm trying to find her a safe place to stay. Would you be willing to write a letter about her academic performance? It might help speed up the process with social services. Of course, Mrs. Rodriguez replied, already reaching for her letterhead. Destiny has so much potential. Just last week, she won first place in the regional science fair with her project on affordable diabetes monitoring systems. Officer Mitchell's heart tightened at this detail. Even in her project choice, Destiny was trying to solve the problem that took her mother's life. Back at the station, he found more paperwork on his desk. A young officer named Jenkins stopped by his cubicle. "Hey, Mitchell," Jenkins said, holding a manila folder. "I did some digging about that girl you asked about. Found her mother's death certificate and medical records. It's pretty rough stuff." Officer Mitchell opened the folder. Medical bills piled up, insurance denied, insulin rationing. The story was all too familiar in their community. He noticed a small detail at the bottom of one form. Destiny's mother had been only 32 years old. His phone buzzed. It was a text from Sarah, his wife. "Called my friend at the youth shelter. They have a temporary bed available. Girl can stay for 2 weeks while we figure something out. Love you." Officer Mitchell smiled. Sarah had been fully supportive since he told her about Destiny. "She needs us," Sarah had said, remembering their own daughter. "We can't let another child slip through the cracks." He was about to respond when another officer rushed to his desk. "Mitchell, you need to see this. Temperatures dropping to freezing tonight. They're predicting snow." His heart raced. Destiny was still planning to sleep in the park. The blanket he gave her wouldn't be enough in freezing weather. He grabbed his coat and car keys. "Jenkins," he called out, "finish processing that emergency housing paperwork. I need it ready by tonight." As he drove toward the park, his mind raced with possibilities. The youth shelter was a start, but it wasn't a long-term solution. Destiny needed more than just a temporary bed. She needed a home, stability, and people who cared about her future. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. Soon, Destiny would arrive at her usual bench with her textbooks and determination. But if Officer Mitchell had anything to say about it, this would be the last night she spent in the cold. That evening, Officer Mitchell and his wife Sarah sat at their kitchen table, surrounded by foster care application forms. The house felt eerily quiet, just as it had since Emily passed away. Emily's room upstairs remained untouched, her science fair trophies still collecting dust on the shelves. "Are you sure about this?" Officer Mitchell asked his wife softly, watching as she filled out another form. "Becoming foster parents is a big step." Sarah looked up from the paperwork, her eyes determined. "James, you told me about this girl every night for the past week. How she studies under streetlights. How she keeps her uniform clean despite sleeping on a bench. How she wants to become a doctor." She reached across the table and squeezed his hand. "She reminds you of Emily, doesn't she?" Officer Mitchell nodded, his throat tight. Emily would have been her age now. They both had that same drive, that same determination to help others. "Then we have to help her," Sarah said firmly. "Emily would have wanted us to." They worked through the night, filling out form after form. Emergency foster care certification, background checks, home inspection requests, financial statements. The pile of completed paperwork grew steadily larger. Around midnight, Sarah went upstairs and opened Emily's room for the first time in months. She ran her hand over the purple bedspread, Emily's favorite color. Family photos lined the walls, Emily at her science fairs, at the beach, in the hospital still smiling despite everything. Sarah took a deep breath and began to pack some of the items into boxes. "We'll keep the photos," she called down to James. "But maybe we could paint the walls a different color. Give Destiny a fresh start." Officer Mitchell climbed the stairs and stood in the doorway of Emily's room. The sight still made his heart ache, but tonight it felt different. Like maybe it was time to let some light back in. "We'll need to take some parenting classes," he said, picking up one of Emily's old teddy bears. "And there will be home inspections." "We can do it," Sarah replied, her voice stronger now. "I've already called the foster care agency. They're sending someone tomorrow morning to start the process." Just then, Officer Mitchell's phone buzzed. It was a text from Mrs. Rodriguez, Destiny's guidance counselor. Destiny just won the state science competition. Her project on affordable diabetes monitoring could help thousands. But she wasn't there to accept the award. No one knows where she lives. Sarah read the message over his shoulder and wiped away a tear. That settles it. We're doing this. The next morning, they met with Ms. Thompson from the foster care agency. She sat in their living room, reviewing their initial paperwork. The process usually takes several months, Ms. Thompson explained, looking through her glasses at the anxious couple. But given the emergency nature of the situation and Officer Mitchell's position in law enforcement, we might be able to expedite things. How long? Sarah asked, gripping her husband's hand. Best case scenario, 2 weeks for emergency certification, but you'll need to complete 30 hours of training classes, pass background checks, and have your home inspected. Officer Mitchell leaned forward. We'll do whatever it takes. That girl can't spend another winter night in that park. Ms. Thompson's expression softened. I can see how committed you both are. I'll do my best to help speed things along. She paused, looking around the living room. You'll need to prepare a room for her. We have one, Sarah said quietly. It just needs a fresh coat of paint. After Ms. Thompson left, Officer Mitchell and Sarah stood in Emily's room again. The afternoon sun streamed through the windows, illuminating the dust particles in the air. Emily would have liked her, Sarah said, touching one of the science fair photos. They could have been friends. Officer Mitchell wrapped his arm around his wife's shoulders. Maybe this is why we couldn't bring ourselves to change this room all these years. Maybe we were just waiting for the right moment, the right person. Outside, the first snow of winter began to fall. They had a lot of work to do, and time was running out. But for the first time in 3 years, their house felt like it might become a home again. 1 week into the foster care application process, Officer Mitchell sat in an uncomfortable chair at the social services office, his leg bouncing nervously. The interview wasn't going well. Across the desk, Mr. Peterson, a stern-faced supervisor, frowned at the paperwork. Officer Mitchell, Mr. Peterson said, adjusting his glasses, while we appreciate your interest in fostering, there are concerns. What kind of concerns? Officer Mitchell asked, trying to keep his voice calm. Well, for one, you and your wife lost a child 3 years ago. The psychological evaluation suggests you might not be emotionally ready. Mr. Peterson shuffled through more papers. And then there's the matter of cross-racial placement. Taking in an African-American teenager requires special cultural considerations. Officer Mitchell felt his face growing hot. With all due respect, sir, Destiny is sleeping in a park. She's maintaining straight as while homeless. Does her safety matter less than cultural considerations? Of course not, Mr. Peterson replied stiffly. But we have to consider all factors. Your neighborhood has very little diversity. The school district you're in is predominantly white. We have to think about what's best for the child. Meanwhile, at the youth shelter where Destiny was temporarily staying, she faced her own challenges. The shelter was clean but crowded, with 6 girls sharing one small room. Her belongings were limited to what could fit in a small locker, and studying was difficult with the constant noise. Hey, new girl, one of the older teens called out as Destiny tried to read her chemistry textbook. Why you always studying? Think you're better than us? Destiny ignored them, just like she ignored the whispers and stares. She focused on her books, on her dreams, on the memory of her mother. But at night, lying on the narrow shelter bed, she couldn't help but worry. The 2-week maximum stay limit was approaching fast. Back at the social services office, Officer Mitchell wasn't giving up. Look at her academic record, he insisted, pulling out Mrs. Rodriguez's letter. She just won the state science competition. She has a chance at a scholarship. Moving her to a different school district could ruin that. Mr. Peterson sighed. Officer Mitchell, I understand your concern, but there are established foster families in the black community who might be better suited. Who are all full, Officer Mitchell interrupted. I've called every agency in the district. Meanwhile, we have a spare room, a stable home, and enough love to give. Isn't that what matters most? Just then, there was a knock at the door. Sarah entered, carrying a thick folder. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said, but I thought you should see these. She placed the folder on Mr. Peterson's desk. Inside were dozens of letters, from police officers, teachers, community members, even the owner of the laundromat where Destiny washed her clothes. All these people know Destiny, Sarah explained. They've watched her struggle, seeing her determination. They're all vouching for us, asking you to give us a chance to help her. Mr. Peterson opened letter after letter, his frown deepening. Officer Mitchell held his breath. There's more, Sarah continued. We've already enrolled in cultural sensitivity training at the community center. We've connected with Black family support groups in the area. We're not trying to ignore Destiny's identity. We want to help her embrace it. The supervisor was quiet for a long moment. Finally, he looked up. The process still can't be rushed. There are procedures, protocols. She's sleeping in a shelter, Officer Mitchell said quietly. Winter is here. Every day we wait is another day she struggles. Please, just tell us what else we need to do. Mr. Peterson looked between them, then pulled out a fresh form. A home inspection needs to be completed first. Then there's a series of interviews, background checks. We'll do it all, Sarah said firmly. Whatever it takes. As they left the office that afternoon, snow was falling again. Officer Mitchell checked his watch. Almost time for Destiny's after-school study session at the shelter. He had promised to bring her practice essay books today. It's not a no, Sarah said encouragingly, squeezing his hand. But it's not a yes either, he replied, watching the snowflakes fall. And time is running out. News travels fast in a small town, and the story of a homeless honor student sleeping in the park touched many hearts. It started with Mrs. Rodriguez, the guidance counselor, who couldn't keep quiet after learning about Destiny's situation. She shared the story with other teachers, carefully leaving out personal details but emphasizing the urgency. One cold morning, Officer Mitchell arrived at the police station to find his desk covered with envelopes. His fellow officers had organized a collection for Destiny's school supplies and winter clothes. Even gruff old Sergeant Thompson had contributed, mumbling something about his own daughter as he dropped off a warm coat. At Roosevelt High School, things were changing too. The principal, Dr. Williams, called an emergency staff meeting after hearing about Destiny's situation. This young lady won the state science competition while homeless, she announced to the assembled teachers. She never missed a single class, never made excuses. Now it's our turn to help her. The teachers quickly organized a plan. The gym teacher arranged for Destiny to have unlimited access to the locker room showers. The cafeteria staff made sure she always had a hot breakfast and lunch. The librarian created a special quiet study space where Destiny could work in peace after school hours. But the biggest surprise came from Mrs. Chen, Destiny's chemistry teacher. She had submitted Destiny's diabetes monitoring project to a national science competition without telling her. Officer Mitchell, Mrs. Chen said excitedly over the phone, the project won first place. It comes with a $10,000 scholarship for college. They want to feature Destiny's story in the local news. At first, Destiny was hesitant about public attention. But when she learned that her story might help other homeless students, she agreed to a small interview with the local newspaper. The article, titled Homeless Honor Student Dreams of Becoming Doctor, ran on the front page. It detailed how Destiny maintained perfect grades while sleeping in a park, driven by her mother's memory and her dream of helping others. The story mentioned Officer Mitchell and his wife's efforts to become her foster parents, and the bureaucratic hurdles they faced. The response was overwhelming. Within days, the newspaper's office was flooded with letters and emails. Community members called the social services office, asking why the process was taking so long. Local church groups organized prayer circles. The mayor's office received countless calls. Mr. Peterson, the stern supervisor from social services, found himself under increasing pressure. His own daughter had read the article and asked him at dinner, "Dad, why aren't you helping that girl?" The turning point came when Reverend Jackson, a respected leader in the Black community, visited the social services office. He sat across from Mr. Peterson, his presence commanding attention. "I understand your concerns about cross-racial placement," the Reverend said calmly, "but I've met the Mitchells. I've seen their commitment not just to housing Destiny, but to supporting her identity and dreams. Sometimes love crosses all boundaries." That same afternoon, Mrs. Washington from the local Black Parents Association arrived with more letters of support. "We'll be there to support Destiny and the Mitchells," she promised. "Our community takes care of its own, and the Mitchells have shown they want to be part of that community." At the youth shelter, Destiny was packing her few belongings, her 2-week stay limit approaching its end. She carefully folded her school uniform and placed her precious science competition medal in her backpack. The shelter staff had been kind, but she knew she couldn't stay longer. Then her phone buzzed. A text from Officer Mitchell. "Need you to come to the police station right away. Bring your things." When she arrived, she found not just Officer Mitchell and Sarah, but also Mrs. Rodriguez, Reverend Jackson, Mrs. Washington, and even Mr. Peterson. They were all smiling. Mr. Peterson stepped forward, holding a stack of papers. "Sometimes," he said, looking at Destiny with newfound respect, "it takes a whole community to remind us what really matters. Your emergency foster care placement with the Mitchells has been approved." For the first time in months, Destiny felt tears of joy rolling down her cheeks as Sarah wrapped her in a warm embrace. 2 years later, the auditorium of Roosevelt High School was packed for graduation day. Colorful graduation caps dotted the crowd like spring flowers, and excited chatter filled the air. In the front row, Destiny sat in her valedictorian robes, her hands folded neatly in her lap. In the audience, Officer Mitchell and Sarah beamed with pride. Sarah held a video camera in one hand and tissues in the other. Next to them sat Mrs. Washington from the Black Parents Association, who had become like a grandmother to Destiny, teaching her to make cornbread just like Destiny's mother used to. Principal Williams stepped up to the microphone. "And now, it is my great honor to introduce our class valedictorian, a young woman whose story has inspired our entire community. Please welcome Destiny Williams Mitchell." The crowd erupted in applause as Destiny walked to the podium. She had officially taken the Mitchell's last name 6 months ago when they adopted her, though she kept Williams as her middle name to honor her mother's memory. 2 years ago, Destiny began, her voice clear and strong. "I was sleeping on a park bench, trying to study under streetlights. Today, I stand before you as proof that sometimes angels wear police uniforms, and miracles come in the form of people who refuse to look away from someone else's pain." In the audience, Officer Mitchell wiped away tears as Destiny continued. "My mother taught me that education was the key to a better life. She didn't live to see me graduate, but her dream lives on. This fall, I'll be attending Johns Hopkins University on a full pre-medical scholarship. My diabetes monitoring project has been picked up by a medical technology company, and they're developing it into an affordable device that could help thousands of people." She paused, looking at her foster parents, now her legal parents, in the audience. "But the biggest lesson I learned wasn't in any textbook. I learned that family isn't just about blood. It's about the people who choose you, who fight for you, who paint their daughter's purple bedroom yellow because they know you love sunflowers. It's about a community that comes together to lift up one of their own." There wasn't a dry eye in the auditorium as Destiny turned to address her classmates. "To my fellow graduates, I want you to remember this. We all have the power to change someone's life. Officer Mitchell could have just driven past that park bench. My teachers could have ignored the signs that something was wrong. The community could have looked the other way, but they didn't. And because they didn't, I'm standing here today." After the ceremony, as families gathered for photos, Destiny stood with the Mitchells in front of the school's fountain. On her graduation cap, she had painted 3 things: a park bench, a police badge, and a yellow sunflower. Around these symbols, she had written the words "Dream, Persist, Rise." Mrs. Rodriguez came over with a special gift, a framed photo of Destiny's State Science Fair victory. In the background of the photo, barely visible, was a small photo of Emily Mitchell on the school's memorial wall. Somehow, both girls' dreams of helping others had found a way to live on. Later that evening, the Mitchells hosted a graduation party in their backyard. The whole community came to celebrate: teachers, police officers, church members, and friends. Reverend Jackson said a blessing, Mrs. Washington brought her famous cornbread, and Mr. Peterson from Social Services showed up with a gift and an apology for his initial doubts. As the sun set, Destiny slipped away to her room, the yellow room that had once been purple. On her desk sat 2 photographs in a double frame. On one side was a picture of her mother, smiling and full of life. On the other was a photo of Emily Mitchell, taken during her last science fair. Between these photos stood Destiny's acceptance letter to medical school and her adoption papers. Officer Mitchell found her there, lost in thought. "You okay, sweetie?" he asked softly. Destiny turned to him with tears in her eyes. "I just wish they could both see this." "They can," he said, pulling her into a hug. And they're so proud of you. We all are. Outside, the summer breeze rustled through the leaves of a young sunflower plant growing in the garden, a symbol of hope, growth, and new beginnings. Where once there had been only loss and emptiness, love had bloomed again, proving that sometimes the best families are the ones we create together.